Welcome to Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. How does the conflict in the Middle East look from the perspective of a remote hill in Lebanon more than 20 years ago? Author and former Israeli soldier Matti Friedman is here to talk about his book, Pumpkinflowers.
This kind of war was a war fought by a modern military on hostile territory against a group that was weaker but more determined and ultimately stronger.
Do we all just need to try a little harder? A book called Grit argues that passion and perseverance can make up for lack of talent. Our reviewer, Judith Shulevitz, is here to discuss it.
So she argues that what we need to cultivate in our children and in ourselves is this trait, which allows you to sort of barrel through failure and obstacles and achieve success.
This week we have our big spring children's books issue, and Maria Russo, our children's books editor, will be talking to Sherman Alexie about his very first picture book.
And when I talk about diversity, I always think, well, is our work representing who we are now, in the moment, contemporary? And that was something important to me.
Alexandra Alter has literary news. Plus, Greg Cowles, Parul, Sehgal, and I get to talk about what we and other people are reading. Matti Friedman served in the Israeli army in the late 1990s, well before the Middle East had weathered the Arab Spring and the most recent wars in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Friedman was stationed at a remote outpost in Lebanon called the Pumpkin toward the end of Israel's 18-year presence there. His book, Pumpkinflowers, is part memoir and part history of those years. Matti is here now to talk about the book. Matti, great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
So this is a memoir about your time in the Israeli army. When was that?
The end of the 1990s, between 1997 and 2000.
And why write about it now?
The experiences that I had and other Israeli men my age had in Lebanon ended up, I think, being a kind of foreshadowing of the wars that Americans have seen in the 21st century in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And that, I think, makes those experiences quite relevant to understanding the Middle East and the rest of the world in 2016.
Did you know that you wanted to write about this eventually, but it wasn't time yet? Or did you think, I never want to write this? Or
I did. I made an initial attempt to write about it not long after I was discharged in 2000. And I wrote a very, I think, unformed and kind of maybe immature version of these events without understanding really what had happened and without any ability to have perspective on the events. That attempt went nowhere and got shelved, thank God. And I went back to it a few years ago, about 4 years ago, because the experiences, although I expected to forget them, I think I expected them to fade as most experiences do. They never did fade. And as time went on, as I watched events in the Middle East unfold, and as I watched the American wars in the Middle East unfold, my experiences at this Outpost Pumpkin in South Lebanon, it became more and more clear to me that these experiences were more important than I had understood as a young soldier, and that there might be some value in going back to them as a more mature person and as I hope, a better writer.
You weren't born in Israel. You're Canadian by birth. How did you end up moving to Israel?
After I finished high school in Toronto in 1995, I went to spend a year on a kibbutz in Israel. And I was supposed to go back home after that year, but it kind of got out of hand, and I'm still there 21 years later.
Wow. Do you have family there, or did you have family at the time?
I didn't at the time. My family ended up moving there a few years after me, so my parents and my sister ended up in Israel as well.
So what year was that you got there, and then when did you end up in the army?
I moved there in 1995 and was drafted in 1997 when I was 19.
So you must have known, obviously, moving there at that age, that would happen. And was that something you wanted to do?
I saw it as a ticket into Israeli society. I wanted to live in Israel, and I wanted to be part of the society. And the way to become Israeli is by doing army service along with other guys your age. So yes, I knew it was going to happen. I knew that when I became an Israeli citizen, that would trigger the draft notice. Mm-hmm. And that's what happened. So when I was 19, I was drafted in the summer of 1997.
And did that experience make you feel like now you were Israeli as opposed to before? Or did you already feel like you were?
No, it was the experience that did it in a very weird way. I became Israeli in Lebanon at this army outpost where I ended up in this strange war that I kind of blundered into as a kid from a quiet neighborhood in Toronto. So my absorption into Israeli society really happened on this strange hilltop in South Lebanon. And when I came out of the army in 2000, I was very much, I think, part of the culture and part of the Israeli mainstream, having had these very intense experiences that I shared with other Israeli men my age.
That explains the title where you were posted in Lebanon. Why was it called the Pumpkin?
Israeli military language is oddly floral. Mm-hmm. So the U.S. military tends towards code names like Hellfire and Predator.
Desert Storm.
things
all.
like that. Israeli military jargon is very, very different. It's quite interesting. So all of the outposts in Lebanon were named after plants. So our outpost was called Outpost Pumpkin, and nearby was Outpost Citrus, Red Pepper, Cypress, Basil. The military code word on the military radio for casualties is flowers. So if you have casualties, you say on the radio, we have flowers. The code word for a fatality isn't KIA, which it is in the U.S. military. It's oleander, or in Hebrew, harduf. So if you have a fatality, you don't say we have a dead soldier. You say we have an oleander. And there are other examples of this strange floral language which provides these oddly beautiful euphemisms for the ugliest things that humanity can cook up.
So situate us a little bit in terms of what was going on in Lebanon, in Israel at the time, and what you were doing at the Pumpkin.
Throughout the 1990s, Israel maintained a strip of land inside Lebanon that Israelis called the security zone, and it was meant to serve as a buffer between the northern border of Israel and guerrillas inside Lebanon. Throughout the 1990s, the group that was of most concern to Israel was Hezbollah, which became increasingly strong as the 90s went on. So inside this security zone were isolated outposts miles north of the Israeli border, one of them the Pumpkin, and there was a small but increasingly deadly guerrilla war that took place in that territory throughout the 1990s, a war of ambushes and IEDs and videotaped attacks and some suicide bombing, a kind of warfare that looks pretty familiar from 2016. It got worse and worse throughout the 1990s. Public pressure built inside Israel. Public displeasure with military strategy built as the 1990s progressed until in 2000, in the spring of 2000, the army blew up all of the outposts with their beautiful floral names, including the Pumpkin, and withdrew from South Lebanon.
So your time there was not, a sort of sitting and watching and waiting, but very much active.
Well, these wars tend to involve a lot of sitting and watching and waiting. I write in the book that if this was an honest history of that time, it would be hundreds and hundreds of pages of daydreams and random thoughts driven by boredom and exhaustion and disorientation, punctuated by a very quick tragedy once every 100 pages or so, and then 100 more pages of waiting. Most of the time, nothing happened.
And you mentioned when we first started talking that the reason you wrote this now was because you felt like there were resonances you can see now in that experience. Can you explain a little bit more about what you mean by that?
The kind of warfare that we saw emerge in South Lebanon in the 90s without realizing that it was important and without even thinking about it very much. We were 19, so our capacity for thought was limited. This kind of war was a war fought by a modern military on hostile territory against a group that was weaker but more determined and ultimately stronger, in that the military eventually realizes that its goals, if there were any concrete goals, were unachievable and withdrew. And the war was punctuated by tactics that are now very familiar to us, like IEDs and like the use of media to kind of psych out your opponent, which has been done with great effect by similar groups to the United States since 2001. The war that we saw in Lebanon in the 90s was kind of a laboratory for everything that came after. So if you want to understand the Middle East of the 21st century, and I think we all need to understand the Middle East of the 21st century because it won't leave us alone, I think understanding what happened in Lebanon in the 90s is a very good place to start.
But you say that in the book that it's not just sort of about the way that terrorists operate militarily, but also that you can see the roots in this in terms of where Israelis are today and their sort of point of view on the prospect of peace in the Middle East, that the roots of that were visible back then.
Right. In the 90s, if you look at newspaper clippings from the 1990s, and I spent a lot of time doing that, trying to find tidbits of information about the war in the security zone, you see that the big story of the 1990s was the peace process that was supposed to bring about a new Middle East, and most Israelis were hoping for that, and I certainly was. Lebanon. The war in Lebanon at the time seemed like the end of something. It seemed like the end of this battle of the Middle East that would soon be replaced by a Middle East of peace and trade and movement of people across borders. And we would go to shop in Damascus, and people from Baghdad would come to Tel Aviv to the beach. And that was the story in the 90s. And on the periphery of people's attention was this strange war going on in Lebanon, being fought by people who no one really took seriously in the 90s. And it seemed like a strange remnant of something that would soon be gone. In retrospect, though, the new Middle East was created in the 1990s, but it wasn't created around negotiating tables. It was created in South Lebanon. And that model of the Middle East of militant Islam, that has come to define the region, and not the optimistic ideas that we had in that hopeful decade.
Has the book come out in Israel?
It will be coming out. It has been translated, and it should be out in the fall in Hebrew.
Are you going to be writing it in Hebrew?
No, I actually made an attempt to translate a few chapters into Hebrew, and my editor in Hebrew thanked me and said that it was not necessary for me to continue in those efforts.
You were fired from writing your own book in
Hebrew. Better leave it to the pros.
When you were writing it, did you think of that you were writing this for an American or a Canadian, a North American audience, or did you think about writing it also for Israelis? And I would think that the two readerships would read something like this in very different ways.
I think that even if it's a word-for-word translation, the book in Hebrew will be a completely different book just because Israelis will read it in a completely different way. This book was written for English readers in English. I've done my best to make it accessible to people who have never heard of the war in South Lebanon, who don't know very much about Israel necessarily, and I hope I've succeeded.
Do you worry at all about how it's going to come across now to your adopted fellow countrymen?
No, I'm actually quite eager to see it published in Israel. These experiences and the strange war in South Lebanon, which doesn't even have a name, it doesn't have a military ribbon, it doesn't have a monument, it has left virtually no collective memory, even though it left very strong personal memories for thousands of Israeli men, is kind of a black box for Israel. It has barely been discussed since the withdrawal in 2000. If you're looking for an academic history of the war in the security zone, for background, there is none. No book has been written about it. So I'm hoping that this book might trigger a surfacing of memory about that time and a kind of an attempt to deal with what those years were and what they've meant. I think they're incredibly important for understanding where the country is now and where the world has gone since the Israeli withdrawal in 2000. It's very easy to remember short, painful events like a war that lasts 6 days. That's pretty easy to remember, and everyone, of course, remembers it. It's hard to talk about a war that lasted 10 or 15 years.
But you wrote it mostly as a memoir, as a personal story.
Much of it is a memoir. Much of it is my own personal stories, but a lot of it is the stories of other soldiers who served on this hilltop. Mainly one soldier whose name is Avi, who served at the Pumpkin from 1994 to 1997. So before I was there, and witnessed a series of ultimately devastating events on the hill. There are other characters in the book, some of whom are friends of mine, and some of whom are people who I found doing research for the book. Some of whom survived, and some of whom didn't.
Was it hard taking on their stories?
Yes, I needed to be very, very careful, particularly with the stories of soldiers who didn't survive. And I took, I hope, great care with the details of their stories. I wanted to make sure that they weren't portrayed as angels or as two-dimensional characters. There is that tendency when writing about the dead to turn them into perfect human beings, which I think does them a disservice. So I've tried to make them human without insulting their memory.
For you, these things happened obviously a long time ago now. Did you feel, was it cathartic for you?
I think there's some satisfaction in having the events written down in order as a story, because the events of Lebanon in the 90s have never been written down, and they're just individual memories carried by people who've never met each other. The story of the Pumpkin has never been put together as a story. I had to collect the pieces and put them together. So I don't know about catharsis. I didn't come out of there deeply traumatized, and I didn't need psychological healing, but there's satisfaction in having it cataloged in this way. If you want to know about the Pumpkin and the war in South Lebanon, there is a book about it. Well,
so far it's getting excellent reviews here compared in our pages to an Israeli, the things they carried. So
you can't get better than that.
Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for being here.
It was a real pleasure.
The book again is Pumpkinflowers, A Soldier's Story by Matti Friedman. Alexandra Alter joins me now. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
You've noticed something new in the book world that's not new.
That's right. A lot of the trends that I notice in the literary world are actually fairly old, but there's an interesting cluster of novels coming out this spring and into the summer that are about famous writers. And of course, this is a favorite topic of novelists. Who wouldn't want to imagine the inner life and the creative struggle of your favorite novelist? But the crop that's coming out this spring and summer includes novels about George Eliot, Walt Whitman, that one's a literary detective story, Anton Chekhov, Samuel Beckett, and Herman Melville. So there's quite a few coming out, and I actually read an interesting analysis of this trend on LitHub, which is a great literary website, by the book critic Heller McAlpin. And she pointed out, that writers are always drawn to the biographies of the writers they love for a whole range of reasons, but maybe they're looking for inspiration or, a way to discover kind of the roots of the genius of their favorite writers, or maybe they want to imagine how these literary giants dealt with their own creative struggles. And for readers, I think these books are fun because it gives you insight into some of the writers that you love without sort of having to read a hefty cradle-to-grave kind of typical literary biography. So some of the ones that I think are notable that are coming out include Denicia Smith's The Honeymoon, which is coming out from Other Press in May. And that is about George Eliot's late life marriage to John Walter Cross, who was a family friend of hers. He was 20 years younger than her, and he was bipolar and attempted suicide on their honeymoon in Venice.
Presumably not diagnosed as bipolar at the time.
Right. I think they had, other
posthumous
terms.
diagnosis.
I'm sure that's true. He was probably suffering from some humors or something like that. Nerves, exactly. But this is an interesting kind of look at, George Eliot, the novelist, who is, in fact, her name was Marian Evans, and her romantic liaisons, because, of course, this match didn't exactly work out. She found romantic fulfillment elsewhere. And so that's coming out in May. And then in June, Viking is publishing The Whale by Mark Beauregard, which is about Herman Melville, the whale. That sort of gives it away. Bonus, there's also Nathaniel Hawthorne in there. It's about their apparent love for each other and their attraction to each other, and how Herman Melville was so consumed by his passion for Hawthorne.
Alleged passion.
Alleged, let's say. But I'm talking about the novel, so
Okay.
This is not a literary biography. I don't have to put in the caveats of whether it's factually accurate. This is fiction. In this fictional retelling, Herman Melville is in love with Nathaniel Hawthorne, and that kind of, unfulfilled passion gives rise to the story of Captain Ahab's pursuit of the great white whale. So
We've devoted a few short lists lately to this phenomenon called homages.
Yes.
Either to famous writers or to famous characters in other writers' novels, which is why I said nothing new here.
No,
in
it's
a
really
way.
not new. I mean, that's true. There, you look at Michael Cunningham's The Hours about Virginia Woolf, or Colm Toibin's novel about Henry James. I mean, this has happened a lot. It's just there's a particular crop of them that I think is interesting. And
New books about people we know well.
exactly. One more that I'll mention is Alison Anderson's novel, The Summer Guest, which is coming out from Harper in May. And it's about, it features a portrait of Anton Chekhov and looks at his friendship with a young woman in the Ukraine who's been blinded by a brain tumor. And I'm interested in this one in particular because Alison Anderson is a well-known literary translator. She translates many books from the French. So I think it's interesting that she's writing her own fiction as well.
All right. Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks for having me.
How much of success is about innate talent and how much is about something more? Author Angela Duckworth says it's about grit, that stick-to-your-guns quality that apparently can be taught and developed in both kids and adults. Her book is called Grit, The Power of Passion and Perseverance. Judith Shulevitz wrote our review, and she's here with me now to talk about it. Hi, Judith.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, grit. It sounds like something we can all agree is good. But
Yep.
what's the book about?
The book is about this character trait, which is, as she says, perseverance, stick-to-itiveness, what my grandfather would have called Sitzfleisch, which means just keeping your bottom in the chair. She argues that it is a better predictor of success than talent or IQ. So she argues that what we need to cultivate in our children and in ourselves is this trait, which allows you to sort of barrel through failure and obstacles and achieve success.
Who is Angela Duckworth, who is no slacker?
No, she's no slacker. She is sort of a pure product of the meritocracy. Harvard, McKinsey, Teach for America. She sort of hit all the marks. But at a certain point, she decided that she risked becoming a kind of dilettante and decided to go back to school.
A dilettante.
Yes, exactly. Because she was sort
That's the way we all become dilettantes.
Exactly. Flitting from one typical overachiever's job to another. So she decided she wanted to go back to school and find out what made children succeed, what trait differentiated those who sort of rose to the top of the classes she had taught from those who did not.
And what does she teach? Is she a
taught
psychologist?
Science.
Okay.
She taught science, and she is now a psychologist.
And she has her own lab.
Yes, at the University of Pennsylvania.
Called the Duckworth Lab.
Yes, or the Character Lab. I've seen it referred to.
What does she do there? What is her research exactly?
Her research is on what predicts success. How do you determine who fails and who succeeds? How do you measure grit? And how do you change mindsets so that people can be grittier?
So the book is kind of a hybrid pop culture, pop science distillation of her research combined with how to.
I argue that it's more how to than even pop science, although it is pop science. And that is one of my criticisms of it, because I think the self-help genre sort of brings with it a kind of baggage that those who write in it may not even be aware of, which is it's all about self-improvement and this American cult of success, individual success.
But grit itself, I mean, it sounds like, again, something that how can one argue against grit? What do you want, flab? What's wrong with her argument itself?
I don't think there's anything wrong with the argument itself. What I object to in the book is the lack of context. Mm-hmm. So this is the kind of book that takes a single finding and says, this is the key to success. Well, that's never the case. There are a million keys to success.
And what is success?
And what is success, right? And which she never offers a critique of, which I think is itself problematic. But grit is something that occurs in a social context, or success is something that is achieved in a social context. Mm-hmm. Success has many fathers, as they like to say, or many parents. Actually, the best predictor of the kind of life you're going to lead, the standard of living you're going to achieve, is who your parents were.
Right, which Americans don't like to hear.
No, which Americans don't like to hear. Duckworth knows this. She's not talking about it. She's talking about grit, mm-hmm. All power to her. But when she writes a self-help book, she elevates this one trait to the sort of single cause of everything and fails to put it in its social context. And I think that has problematic effects, and I think that her theory of grit has sort of worked down through the culture in problematic ways.
There are a lot of books like this, though, that say, like, here's the one thing that you need to do, that we all want that one key answer. But with this one, part of me feels like I've heard this a little bit before, that you don't need to be talented, you just need to try harder. And I'm curious, the book that I think of most immediately is Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers, with its idea of 10,000 hours of practice.
Right.
How does this differ from Gladwell's argument?
Not that much, but she's not focused on practice, and mm-hmm. she does have a broader scope of what constitutes success. She's focused on the development of something she calls, and borrowing this phrase from another psychologist, the growth mindset, which is instilling in students and in people the idea that you must believe that grit matters in order to succeed. So you don't have to just have grit, because that would be another case of having a certain quality, right, and that sort of elevating you to the top. But you also have to sort of come to believe that you can change, that change is possible.
In your review, you say that, like, were this a PowerPoint presentation, as it surely was at some point, that you could kind of boil down what she says to these two equations. What are those equations?
So the equations are, they sort of demonstrate the argument. Talent times effort equals skill, right? So if you have talent but you apply yourself, you get the skill. Skill times effort equals achievement. So you need effort twice. Effort counts twice. So it's twice as important.
The downside, I mean, the criticism to this would seem to be, and I think there has been this criticism, that, well, if you don't succeed, then you're just not trying.
That's exactly right. So her failure to take success in its social context means that she fails to incorporate the idea that there are really systemic obstacles to success, like, this idea that we no longer really have class mobility, and does wind up implicitly, though she would never say this explicitly, blaming people for their own failures.
And have people criticized her for saying that?
I haven't come across that criticism. The criticism I've come across is the application of this idea in education. So she was very instrumental in developing what was the most influential no excuses charter school, which are these schools that use tough love to change character. And while I don't accuse her of being responsible for what this movement has become, I think that she, by failing to be critical of it and of her own concept of grit, sort of allows it to flourish. And these schools, I think, can be as harmful as they are good. I think tough love, if it isn't combined in equal or greater measure with love, warm love, actually is harmful.
Unconditional love.
Right. Not necessarily unconditional love. It's not a school's job to offer unconditional love, but love. Real love, not just tough love.
There's also a test in the book.
Yes. There's something called the grit scale, which asks you how you evaluate yourself, and which she has applied again and again in situation after situation. For example, at West Point, people who evaluated themselves as high in grit tended to be able to survive a very grueling initiation, a few months of initiation, and those who evaluated themselves as being low in grit tended to drop out. And it was the most predictive test ever given to these cadets. So it sort of proves her point.
Can you give an example of what makes grittiness?
So one question she asks you to rank yourself on is setbacks, or one statement, setbacks don't discourage me. I don't give up easily. I am a hard worker. I finish whatever I begin. I am diligent. I never give up. So those are some of the questions she asks. And she also asks you questions like that demonstrate that you don't have grit. I have difficulty maintaining my focus on projects that take more than a few months to complete.
Now, you took the test and you had your entire family take the test.
Right.
How'd you do?
I was the worst. I was absolutely the worst, which of course depressed me and caused me to criticize myself further.
What does she call the people who go score the lowest on the grit scale? Is there
she doesn't have a term. She doesn't, I don't
it
remember
wasn't
a
like
term.
Slothful or sloppy or
sloth paragons. She calls people who have grit paragon. So I might have been a sloth paragon or a neurotic paragon. One of the problems I have with the grit scale is that because it relies on self-report and self-evaluation, actually if you hold yourself to a sort of punishingly high standard, you are going to fail. Now, I'm not saying I failed because I hold myself to a punishingly high standard. I failed because I'm kind of neurotic and have a somewhat negative self-image, I think. But interestingly, she herself has criticized the application of the grit scale in high-stakes testing. So there are schools in California that are using this kind of a test to evaluate how well the schools are doing on socio-emotional learning, which is an educational movement she has been instrumental in spreading throughout the land. And she herself has written that it should never be applied in this way because it's a very subjective test. Again, as I said, your self-evaluation may depend more on the standards you hold yourself to than on reality.
You're a mom.
Mm-hmm.
Your kids took the test. Reading the book, even though you did have criticism of the argument or the way in which she presented the argument, were there nonetheless things that you took sort of to heart and thought,
Yes.
You know what?
Yes, absolutely. So, you see your kids internalizing this very prevalent notion that either you got it or you don't got it, and there's no point in trying. If you fail a test, you are a failure, and that leads to quitting. You want to say to them, and I've said to them, you got to have grit, because in fact you do have to have grit. It just shouldn't be the single trait that everybody needs to seek.
Duckworth is a huge TED Talk star, 8 million views. It's interesting because reading about that and listening to you reminds me of another great TED Talk, very different, by Catherine Schultz, called Being Wrong. Mm-hmm. And at one point, I don't know if you've watched this talk.
I haven't, but I've read the book.
Well, you've read the book, but now watch the talk.
Yes, I will. Because
but she has this great part where she shows this, marked up test. And she says, everybody knows that when you get this test, and it's sort of a grade school test, and I think it's a C- at the bottom, and see me, that a child gets that and they think I'm a failure.
Right.
And her message about that is quite different. It might be an interesting counterpoint to look at that book when reading Grit.
So to be fair to Duckworth, she says you need to fail and you need to learn from your mistakes. And she holds up as one of her grit paragons a young woman, 13-year-old girl, who became a national spelling bee champion. And she said her method of improving was that she focused on her failures and really worked to overcome them. And that's as much part of grit as just having that stick-to-itiveness, is the ability to learn from your mistakes. So in that, she's not so far away from Catherine Schultz, but that's not what she's emphasizing. What I like about Schultz is she really is saying this is essential, failing. You have to fail.
Well, I think you're going to do better when you retake your grit test, Judith.
Thank you very much. I hope I do, because, I immediately have to sort of run off to bed whenever I fail things. So.
All right, Judith Shulevitz, thank you so much.
Thank you.
The book again is Grit, The Power of Passion and Perseverance by Angela Duckworth. Sherman Alexie's The Absolute True Story of a Part-Time Indian is a huge favorite among middle school kids and YA readers. His latest book is also a coming-of-age story for kids, but this time for much younger ones. Thunder Boy is Alexie's very first picture book. Our children's books editor, Maria Russo, talked recently with Sherman Alexie and with the illustrator of Thunder Boy, Yuyi Morales.
So, Sherman, can you tell me a little bit about Thunder Boy and what his story is?
Well, the genesis of the book was at my father's funeral in 2003. I'm Sherman Alexie Jr. So standing at his graveside, when the coffin was lowered, I happened to be standing at the foot of the grave, not for any specific reason. I just ended up there. And as the coffin lowered, it revealed the tombstone and revealed my name.
Oh, wow.
I mean, I'd always carried his name. I'm Junior in the family, and I'm Junior in my tribe. But as that coffin lowered, the full weight of the legacy of having your father's name really hit me, and I've been carrying it ever since. I've written a few poems about it, but I didn't know what I was going to do with that concept until I wrote about 20 or 30 different picture books trying to find the right idea, and then finally the name just popped into my head.
Thunderboy Jr. So Thunderboy Jr. is a junior, right?
Yes.
His dad is Thunderboy Sr., and he really does not like being a junior.
No, he doesn't like having the same name as his father because he wants his own identity, and he's searching for himself.
When he first tells us this, that he doesn't want to be Thunderboy Jr., it's a big secret. He feels a little bit nervous.
Well, to tell your father that you don't want his name or that you want your own name, I think is quite the rebellion against authority, and I think he worries that it's disrespectful,
right?
Not only to his father but to tribal traditions.
And in the book, we get to see the father character, and we come to agree, I think, with Thunderboy. His father is awesome. He says, "My dad is awesome," but yeah,
right. And the other idea is the giving of Indian names is traditional. Right. It's generally a passage into adulthood, but it marks a change in your life when you get a new name based on something that you've done, some accomplishment, something you love.
And when does it usually happen?
Usually manhood. It's the the native version of the
bar mitzvah
or the bat mitzvah. It's that same sort of time period, moving into adolescence, into puberty.
But Thunderboy is quite a bit younger.
No, he's really young. He's 3 to 6. My other YA book, Absolutely True to a Part-Time Indian, is also about the search for personal identity, but that was in the midst of tragedy and terror and fear and doubt and racism, and I wanted to create a similar story about a Native kid's search for identity, but I wanted to be in the context of a really strong and loving family.
Right, which you can see in the book, and you can really see in Yuyi Morales' illustrations. Can you tell us how you came to work together on this book? Were you able to choose the illustrator, or was it luck?
No, I said, give me somebody brown. So I knew it was vital for me to have somebody from a minority culture, so to speak. She's not a minority where she's from.
Right. And Yuyi is from Mexico.
And but I knew it was important for me to have an artist. So they sent me men and women, I forget how many, books. And as soon as I saw Yuyi's work, I knew her boys were so boy and so unapologetically boy and so lovingly drawn. So there was boy energy popping off the page in a loving way. I've since learned that she's a mother and has a son, so of course that makes perfect sense. But it was instant love and I mean, it wasn't even a question after I saw her work.
And Yuyi, how did you approach Thunder Boy?
First of all, with a lot of enthusiasm, because when I knew that the project was a book written by Sherman, I was very excited.
Yeah.
In my family, we have always admired Sherman's work. I have a mixed family, a family in which we have these Latino characters like the one I am, and then my son is also a mix of Latino and white. And so we've been sharing with his family, his father's family, Sherman's books, and in a way that was not only a discovery for us, but it was also a discovery for our family. We had been admiring your work for a long time, and then when they told me that this manuscript was by Sherman, I had to consider it. It has been a while since I decided I wasn't going to illustrate for other people because
Usually you write the words and do the pictures, which is a different kind
and what
of
happens
process.
is that I pretty much put myself at the end of my own waiting list when I'm working for other people, and I really want to be able to work in my own projects. So I had decided I was going to work for any other authors, except they tell me, well, this is a manuscript by Sherman, and I say, we admire him so much, but let me see the manuscript first. Because even though I might like Sherman's work so much, the manuscript might still not be for me.
Right.
But in this case, yes, it absolutely was for me, and I was very happy to take on the challenge. One of the things that Thunder Boy has is what I, particularly as an illustrator, really like, which is that it is so special that it really leaves place for my own narrative.
Right.
I'm not only reflecting, I'm not only putting a mirror to the work that Sherman is doing, but I'm also able to come with my own storytelling. In this case, yes, the work has to belong to both of us. The book is a book that has to have two voices.
Right.
And being able to bring my own voice to the book and the story was very important to me, and I knew that I was going to be able to do it with Thunder Boy.
And as Sherman mentioned, Thunder Boy's family is big and loving and funny and fun, and that seems to be where you kind of took the story and ran with it and made it your own in creating this family for Thunder Boy beyond just his dad.
Yes, I wanted to have a family there, I guess because it also reflects my own growing up. I had this sense that what Thunder Boy is looking in his identity is not separated from the people that he loves. Like you mentioned before, Sherman is not like he's looking for his own identity in doubts, but he's looking for the identity in something that is familiar to him. It is like how he looks up to his father and realizes that he has his own shine. And also, it's not a process that he goes alone through. There is also this sister who is in the same way that he is looking up to his father.
Very adorable little sister.
Yes,
you
the little
created.
sister is also looking at him and kind of experimenting who she is. So it's not only one way. It's kind of like different steps of a same ladder in which inside the family we get to see from the others who we are not, and decide who we are.
So I just wanted to open the book to my favorite spread, which is right in the middle of the book. It's 2 pages where Thunder Boy is trying to figure out some other names he could have that have to do with cool things he's done. And he says, I once dreamed the sun and moon were my mom and dad, so maybe my name should be Starboy. And then on the next page he says, I'd like to go to garage sales with my mom, so maybe my name should be Old Toys Are Awesome. And the artwork on this page is so incredible. Could you tell us a little bit, Yuyi, about how you created all of these layers of images?
Absolutely. I started the art for Thunder Boy as soon as I got to Mexico, where I was going to be working for a while, and I didn't have a studio. So I got this Mexican ruin in the middle of downtown, and I bought it. It wasn't a place where I could actually live, so I had to remodel it. I had to fix it. And as they were fixing this house, this really old house, a lot of material came out that it was rotten, and from the floors to the roof to the walls, many of this material was taken down, and what it appeared was these pieces of wood that had different colorations, and these clay bricks that also, because they had been under the stucco, once they took off the old stucco, there is these beautiful old bricks with different colorations that time has put into them, and weather. And I decided I was going to create Thunder Boy under the foundation of that place where I was going to start working.
Oh, so it does look like there's almost a wood grain texture under a lot of the pages.
Exactly. So what I did is I created a palette from all these textures and all these colors from the wood. There is also some digital art, so of course there wasn't a yellow or a pink as as bright as you see them in the book. That was part of my work, but the original material that I was used to create all these colors was that I scanned this wood that I just started collecting it as the house was coming down.
Cool.
I started collecting these things that had texture and different colors. And from them, I started painting in the illustrations for Thunder Boy.
That's fantastic. And this pink, I think of, it's a very, very bright pink. I think of as one of your signature colors.
Yes, it's one of my
love
favorite
that.
colors.
And it's so great. And I love how it really does not read as a girl pink, as we would say here. As Sherman was saying, it's such the energy, Thunder Boy's energy is such a little boy energy. And he looks great with that bright pink behind him and around him.
I think that pink has energy. It has both like something that feels like emotions, but also something that feels like power.
And strength. It's
Yeah.
true. I also wanted to talk a little bit about what's happening in the world of children's books right now with the movement for more diverse books. People are calling for more stories about children who are not white, families who are mixed or from different races and ethnicities. Sherman, were you really motivated by what's been happening in the We Need Diverse Books movement to do this book?
Oh, absolutely, especially in the picture book world. There's a lack of brown-skinned protagonists in the teen world, in the YA world, and the picture book world that's even more pronounced.
Right.
And for Native American characters, pretty much every picture book relies on old stories, mythological
Right, a
stuff,
lot of history,
a lot of
but not
history,
a lot of
talking bears and salmon. So, which is fine, but the idea of a contemporary Native American family and Native American character was really important to me, because when we talk about diversity, we don't get very specific sometimes. And when I talk about diversity, I always think, well, is our work representing who we are now,
Right.
in the moment, contemporary? And that was something important to me. But this is a very contemporary family that is also informed by tradition. So, all over the book, as Judy drew these amazing things, are these combination of traditional imagery. There's stars and there's animals, and there is a talking animal. There's a dog, which is awesome. Combined with guitars and chairs and robots.
And the ball that Juji put in that the brother and sister are fighting over.
There's a sub-narrative. So she did an amazing job. And there's influences from Mexican culture and Mexican indigenous culture.
The skirt looks Mexican.
and various tribal traditions in the United States. Juji did a lot of homework and research on the images to put in. It was very, very wary of using a wrong kind of image. So we were looking at those. So, I know the kid is from my tribe, but as with any Native American, we're also pan-Indian, which means there's a national identity as well that's influenced by all sorts of other tribes.
The picture book world does seem to have a real gap when it comes to Native American contemporary life. I almost can't think of another.
Off the top of my head, I can't right now.
Yeah.
Especially, I remember watching a movie called Grand Avenue based on a Native author named Greg Saris, and it was on HBO maybe 15 years ago. And they had a scene where a Native boy was doing his homework at the kitchen table. And I started crying.
Oh, yeah.
Because he was doing his homework, and they actually showed a Native kid doing homework. I also cried in the movie Crazy Horse when they had a love scene between Crazy Horse and his wife, being fully realized human beings, engaged in the ordinary. The power of the domestic.
Yeah.
And that's often something that doesn't get portrayed in literature about Native Americans.
And then having to boil that down to a picture book. Everyone thinks writing a picture book is easy. And
I did so many drafts and had so many ideas and just failed miserably all the time. And I've been trying, since we're doing press, to think about the difficulty. And what it is I think the book is 70% for the kid, and then you're writing 30% for the adult who will be reading to the kids. So there's this balancing act where you have to appeal to a kid mostly, but you have to also have the adult falling in love with it as well. And that's a difficult balance. And yeah, it took me a long time, a lot of editing. And as with anything, there are still things like, it's something better. There's something better. So, it just occurred to me as we were talking, I need to write a book about the sister now.
Oh, that would be great.
Yeah.
Well, and we won't give away the name that Thunder Boy ends up with, but it does seem that it brings him even closer to his dad at the end of the book.
Well, that was one of the things about the kid's agency and finding his self-identity. It was important for me to have the kid have agency and to have independence, but also at key moments for the father to really read his kid, to understand his kid, to empathize with his kid, to be a good father. I mean, being a good parent is about listening, not dictating, and I think the father does that a lot better than I do.
I'm sure that's not true. Well, thank you so much, Sherman and Yuyi, for being with us. This was really fantastic. And the book, again, is Thunder Boy Jr., coming in May from Little Brown.
Greg Cowles and Parul Sehgal join me now to talk about what we are reading and what other people are reading. Thanks for coming, guys.
Hi, Pamela.
Hi, Pamela.
What's new on the bestseller list? Let's start with other people.
Yeah, not much going on the fiction side of things. The only new title is John Sanford's Extreme Prey, which debuts at number 1. But some interesting books over in nonfiction where science continues to do well. The Dutch primatologist Frans de Waal, who we spoke a little bit last week, has his book, Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are? That's new at number 15, looking at the intellectual lives of animals. And at number 10, Michael Kinsley, who founded Slate, a longtime established journalist.
He was on our podcast recently.
Yes, his book, Old Age, which he was talking about during his appearance, collects essays partly about his struggle with Parkinson's and just aging in general, evaluating the baby boomer generation. So that book is new at number 10. The other new book on the nonfiction list this week is Phil Knight's memoir Shoe Dog, new at number 3. He, of course, is the founder of Nike.
Okay, Parul, I don't think you're reading Shoe Dog. Tell us
I'm
what you're
not
reading.
Shoe Dog. So last week, the great novelist and critic Jenny Diskey died at the age of 68. And, she'd been suffering from cancer for a while and writing about it in the LRB. So I've just been reading some of her essays, but also her book, Skating to Antarctica. Have you read it?
No.
Oh, it's so good. It's bloody good. It's just this, it's maddeningly good. It's actually very annoyingly good because it's just about her traveling through America on a train and smoking cigarettes and watching who comes in and who comes out of the room. And
so it's kind of Knausgaard before the fact.
It's interesting because, it is granular, but she's such good company. I don't know. It's a book about solitude. It's a book about America, but not in the typical way that I think Brits and so many foreigners see America, which is everything is just loud and new and kind of crude. But it's the romance of America in a way that I feel is really honest and beautiful. And she's very tart without being a curmudgeon. And it's one of those books that's about nothing, but you're so enraptured. Yeah. And so I'm reading that and it's really good because I do read it on the subway and compare the paucity of my observations with Jenny Diskey's.
I'm reading a book that is, on the contrary, about everything. Les Miserables, which I keep making my way through as my bedtime reading. And I started reading a chapter last night that is one of the many instances when reading this book that you think this is just so incredibly prescient and so modern. And it's a chapter that Victor Hugo called Slang. And he sort of follows, the chapter follows an earlier chapter where we spend a lot of time with the criminal element on the streets of Paris, and he starts to include a lot of slang. And if you have a good translation, it'll include the original French, the slang French, and then the translation. And then he breaks for this chapter slang and says, well, for those of you wondering why there's all this horrible street language in here, let me explain.
A little bit
he
of
says,
Herman Melville
a couple of other people have done this recently, Balzac being one, and people got really angry that they were including this sort of coarse language that doesn't belong in a great novel. But he says in his defense of slang that we all really speak a kind of slang, a kind of argot. He says, business people have their argot. They, speak of profit. And, he then throws out all of these terms that we've now come to just think of as business language. And he says, the philosopher has his language, the phrenologist has his
The
language.
book reviewer has her language.
That's right. The literary critic has his
her compellings.
Yes. And says, and this is their language. And you could just see this exact conversation taking place today when people talk about Ebonics or about any kind of, dialect.
Do you read French? Are you reading this in French or are you reading this in English?
No, the reason I'm reading this now and that I didn't read it 20 years ago probably was that I always said I will not read this unless I read it in French. So I just conveniently put it off and I put it off and I put it off. I finally got to the point where I said, you know what, I am never going to read this in French. So this is my year of 19th century French fiction that I should have read long ago. I'm going to do this, and then I have a bunch of Zola novels that I've been meaning to read. But it's good to know French when reading this because the translation I have, which is Christine Doniger, does an excellent job and I think kind of assumes that you have at least a little bit of a working knowledge of French. She will footnote translations and what Victor Hugo did also was he footnoted certain translations. So he would put in a little bit of street French or slang, and then he would put at the bottom the real French, the traditional French. He would translate the slang for the French reading audience, and then she then translates that to English. So she will include those three layers so that you can see what's been done with the language. And one of the interesting things, and I have to look into this, but there's a current French argot that's existed for quite a while called verlan, which are you familiar with this? It's also called l'envers. So it's a play. You reverse words in French, so you turn them around. It's a little bit like Pig Latin, but so like in French, for example, une femme is a woman, but you can say une meuf, and you turn it around. And there was an instant in the last chapter in which they refer to someone as crazy, and they call her luff. Crazy or stupid instead of folle. So I'm wondering if the verlan goes all the way back to, mid-19th century France.
Wow.
To be continued. All right, Greg, what are you reading?
Well, I would just call attention to a couple of books on our editor's choice list this week, both of which I handled the reviews. And the books really impressed me as kind of a return to form for the authors. Don DeLillo, who I am just in love with his novel Underworld. It was a book that completely blew me away in the late 90s when it came out. I think it was 1997 or 1998 that book came out. And it's, like Les Mis, it's a book just about everything. It captures 50 years of the Cold War, of kind of the American century. And after that, DeLillo kind of fell into writing these little chamber pieces. And some of them were quite lovely. I loved his book, Point Omega, which takes place in the desert. But they're very small, almost like plays. They have limited casts, limited themes and viewpoints. Those were the most noteworthy books that he was writing after Underworld. And he would occasionally turn to a bigger scope novel, a book like Falling Man about 9/11, but it felt almost obligatory. It didn't feel like his heart was really in it. And Zero K, his new novel, it feels like he is completely in this one. And it's much more of a traditional novel, much more back like Underworld, or the smaller White Noise, which was really his breakthrough novel in terms of a mainstream audience. This is a true novel with a bigger cast and bigger themes, very much taking in the modern obsession, the modern technological obsession with holding death at bay. It is about a tech guru, a billionaire, who has put all of his money into establishing a cryogenic facility out in the Eastern European desert somewhere. And he's using that to try to prevent his wife from dying because she's got some debilitating diseases. And then it goes into politics in the second half. It goes into modern-day New York and Ukraine and kind of terror and political revolution and themes that DeLillo has looked at before, but he's really juggling a lot here. Zero K is, of course, a reference to 0 Kelvin, the temperature that you have to bring the body down to for cryogenics, the Kelvin scale. But the science writer John Rennie tweeted out an interesting post suggesting that Kay suggests not just Kelvin but also Kurzweil, because the futurist Ray Kurzweil, also a technology entrepreneur, is very interested in what he calls the singularity, kind of the future when we can hold death at bay by merging humans with technology. And so this book touches on all of that in a really interesting way. And of course, DeLillo just writes beautiful sentences. He's a great prose stylist. So that's a book that I'm happy about right now. And then Richard Russo also kind of returns to form. He's got a sequel to Nobody's Fool, which came out mid-'90s. It was 1994, I think. But it's set 10 years later. It's called Everybody's Fool, a sequel to Nobody's Fool. It's Russo doing what he does best, which is this kind of congenial humor that he does, the small-town foibles of eccentric personalities, sort of a Garrison Keillor type humor, and just great storytelling. So this is, instead of focusing so much on Sully, who was the main character of Nobody's Fool, this focuses on a police officer from Nobody's Fool who has now become the chief of police in the town of North Bath where it's set. And he is obsessed with figuring out whether his late wife had a lover or not. And he's going around town with the garage door opener that he found among her effects, trying to see which garage door it will open. Yeah.
Personally, I would love that.
We all need that.
Also as a reader.
All right. Thanks, Parul. Thanks, Greg.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. Our producer is Jocelyn Gonzalez, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.